Hello everyone, my name is Diane Butcher and this is a presentation that I originally did in March of 2015 as part of my PhD studies at the University of Victoria in the School of Nursing, and it is entitled Interprofessional, Intraprofessional and Collaborative Relationships, Estranging Myself from the Obvious. I have continued pursuing my interest in exploring relationships, silos, and tensions surrounding registered nurse and practical nurse relationships and education, and this arose out of my own experiences teaching in 2 practical nurse programs, as well as completing a critical analysis of discourses in practical nurse education for my master's degree, which I completed in 2013. So today I hope to further describe and explore the intersection of my current thoughts, my work to date in the PhD program, as well as findings on a research study that I have participated in and how it relates to the questions that I have had regarding intraprofessional education between registered nurse and practical nursing students that forms the topic of my dissertation work. This title, Estranging Myself from the Obvious, was inspired by Wackerhausen's ideas regarding becoming a stranger to oneself and thinking the unthinkable to challenge professional dogmas and looking at the taken for granted, the obvious, and what we think we may know, and sort of my own interest in critical pedagogy and theory. And so that is where this presentation has been situated. Of course, for my presentation, I did have some goals, and that was to critically explore the concepts that I've noted in the title and to reflect upon some current research work that I was involved in, and also the other piece of my dissertation work and as well the analysis in the research project pulled in Dorothy Smith's institutional ethnography as a lens from which we were looking at interviews that we had completed with RNs and LPNs. And so I'm also using this lens as part of my dissertation work to analyze the interview data with respect to educational experiences of these RNs and LPNs. And so that is part of my presentation as well and my current dissertation work. This picture is actually a picture of me, and I created this magazine cover for a Masters of Nursing course I took in 2011, and we had to come up with a magazine cover to introduce ourselves to our virtual classmates. And thankfully some of my written references on this page no longer are significant. For example, I no longer work out of my minivan. I have since retired that vehicle. But what's significant about this picture is that it was taken in May, probably in the late 60s, and the occasion was my sister's birthday party, and this is me in the photo in my pedal car. And what was significant were the events that led up to this photo, because I was told by my mother to get dressed for my sister's party. And so I went and coordinated myself with my green and white striped shirt, green shorts, yellow socks, and I was so proud of myself because I coordinated with my outfit to match my green racing car, my yellow helmet, and my green goggles. And I thought that I just looked amazing. And of course, when I proceeded to sit in my car like this created much angst and anger from my mother because she felt that I should be what was considered more representative of the norm of the day for girls at a birthday party. Pretty dresses, shiny patent leather shoes, hair done nicely with barrettes and ribbons, etc., etc. And all I could think of was, ugh, I want none of that. And despite my mom's pleading and demanding, I did not change, and I was left to attend my sister's party looking like this. And of course, there's a photo of my sister's entire party, probably 12 or so kids, all girls, standing side by side in the sunny backyard, all in their pretty dresses, their shiny shoes and pretty hair, and on the far end of the picture, there's me in my pedal car. So as I reflect back now in my young life, I realize, as Dr. Phil would say, a changing day in my life that wrote on the slate of who I am was that early attempt, I think now, to challenge the assumptions, challenge the status quo, and look at the intersections of perhaps some degrees of power. And so to me, when I reflect back on this, I see that very early in my life, I was starting to perhaps utilize some degree of critical perspective in my life to challenge the status quo. And so I think pedagogically now, as a nurse educator, I have found that the critical perspective does continue to resonate with me in various ways and has formed a foundational element of my work in the PhD program. So in terms of my pedagogical lens, where I am situated, a little background on the critical transformative perspective, that the understandings of social phenomena as historically, discursively, and socio-politically constructed. So we're looking at knowledge as being fallible, incomplete, value-laden, as well as challenging ideological constructs that are created within and between language and discursive constructs. And inherent to this is also the exploration of power relationships. So we're looking at challenging realities and the status quo. And I do like this quote from Frere, that the notion of education can either be a tool of conformity or an instrument for liberation. And as well, pulling in some background and knowledge from Habermas and his various viewpoints of knowledge, that we can have technical knowledge, practical knowledge, emancipatory knowledge, and how they influence education as well. And I also take time to reflect as educators, do we teach from this perspective? And perhaps why or why not? And perhaps should we be pulling in critical transformative perspectives into our teaching? So for me, questions regarding intra and interprofessional relationships grew kind of insidiously as I was teaching in a practical nurse program shortly after moving to a new province. One of the reasons I applied to teach in the program was to learn more about LPNs, as I knew the landscape was changing. It had begun to change prior to leaving the previous province I was in, and I felt that as an RN, I needed to know more about how RNs and LPNs were learning and working together. For me, questions began surfacing amidst the predominating discourses of interdisciplinary relationships, interprofessional relationships, and collaboration. Due to the closeness with which RNs and LPN worked and their shared disciplinary knowledge base, I began to wonder to whom interprofessional was referring to. Was this nurses and other healthcare professionals such as physiotherapists, OTs, social work, physicians? And did it also refer to RNs, LPNs, and RPNs? Further, how did one know? And did it matter? Further, my master's project work, as well as my current JBI protocol development, have allowed me to explore in more detail some of the more nuanced interpretations that might become more helpful for me working forward. And so in terms of looking at the term and concept intraprofessional, I found that this might mean students of various years of a particular program, for example, nursing, learning together, or it could mean students under one disciplinary domain, such as nursing, dentistry, OT, but in separate categories of a profession learning together. So baccalaureate nursing and practical nursing students, or OTs and OTAs, dentists, hygienists, and assistants, that type of thing. So I found in the literature that intra and inter were sometimes used without a clear definition. Further, I have often thought about the nature of inter and intraprofessional and whether there were inherent differences or similarities in these concepts, especially within the context of relationships between nurses. That is, were discourses on interprofessionalism addressing particularities of working relationships among categories of nurses? Were these relationships perhaps different from those among nurses and those of other disciplines? Whom might it serve to have or not have intraprofessional relationships addressed or identified? Were relationships as clear as interprofessional discourses made them out to be? Or was there perhaps something missing? And really, does this ambiguity serve a purpose? So really, why should distinctions between intra and interprofessional matter? Well, I was certainly seeing and experiencing tensions and confusion while teaching, and also seeing shifts in the literature. Are there one profession of nurses, 2, 3? And some of the discourses just seemed to talk about masses of caregivers, and what was the significance of this? So we were certainly seeing changes to nursing roles and responsibilities, which is contributing to creating ambiguity, and also confusion regarding scopes of practice. For example, medication admin, patient allocation, workload, and these were resulting in nurses feeling bullied, stressed, and harassed. And really, more questions regarding the impact of this interprofessional conflict for both nurses and, of course, patients that they are looking after. So, in the literature, we're really starting to see that there really is little collaboration between RN and LPN groups regarding education and practice. And so questions are arising: how are nurses renegotiating roles in these changing care contexts? And certainly in the literature, there's been many studies that have now shown relationships related to patient safety and enhanced care with more experienced and educated nurses. They are less overworked, fatigued, and stressed nurses. So considering some of the literature to date, it really did raise a lot of questions regarding what types of collaborative relationships are happening not only for nurses in practice, but in their education. So as in this picture, I have felt that although there is much rhetoric and discussion regarding collaboration, is it really happening in nursing education? And perhaps why or why not? So Wackerhausen talked a bit about barriers and facilitators to developing intraprofessional relationships. For example, there's a habituation of professional identity, and this is following the established everyday trails of professional practice. And this is learned or socialized in our own communities of practice. So perhaps there is an RN community of practice, an LPN community of practice, and we're learning our professional identity through this process of habituation. And Wackerhausen also talks about different sort of layering, if you will, of reflection. And certainly in the nursing literature, there's a lot of research and discussion on reflective practice and looking and reflecting upon one's practice situations as part of professional development. So Wackerhausen talks about first-order reflection. And he talks about this being the predominant type of reflective practice that is referred to in a lot of the literature and in professional practice domains. And he argues that this type of reflection really does not challenge the trails of everyday practice. Rather, it just confirms them. And he argues more for a second-order reflection. And this is where he introduces the concept of thinking the unthinkable. And this is reflecting using varying perspectives, for example, critical perspectives, pulling in different points of view, theories, philosophies. And this helps to actually increase your knowledge base, and it also helps you suspend established dogmas or realities that are currently in place. And this type of reflection actually requires breaking the profession's colonization of and control over the practitioner's reflection. And so I felt this was really valuable to reflect on, and how it tied in perhaps with a critical pedagogical point of view, and raise some questions for me. For example, what are the socially constructed rules regarding nursing education? And secondly, Wackerhausen's concept of epistemic humility, and how does epistemic humility intersect with notions of expert? And Wackerhausen argues that with a particular discipline or profession's knowledge base, that is limited. It's value-laden, it's fallible, and it is limited. It is always incomplete. So no discipline or no profession encompasses all there is to know about everything. And so with this awareness, this epistemic humility, we can never tell the complete truth about something from within a single discipline. It is outside its epistemic reach. And so he argues that genuine collaboration between professions, disciplines, helps to expand knowledge, gets beyond the epistemic reach of individual disciplines and professions. And that this is not only important, but he argues it's ethically required. And so this was a light bulb moment for me, because I really thought about how this changes perhaps the notions of who are experts and why we might consider ourselves or not an expert in a particular domain, and how really, if one positioned themselves with this epistemic humility, how that might help to even the playing field, if you will, in terms of professions and disciplines really being able to move forward collaboratively. And so this bubble was just in the context of my presentation to my classmates, because of course they had background readings, and we engaged in a little bit of background reading prior to coming together to discussion. So I had my group reading some information on institutional ethnography, watching a video by Dorothy Smith, reading Bockerhausen's article, and some other background articles as well. And so that is where this bubble has resided from. So this background and all this critical, pedagogical, philosophical perspective discussion, how does this relate to my current research activities? Well, I had the privilege of working as a research assistant on a project with my supervisor and my committee member, Dr. Karen McKinnon and Dr. Ann Bruce, and we interviewed RNs and LPNs for a study entitled Working to Their Full Scope, exploring changing work relationships between RNs and LPNs. And so we have identified 3 threads and have done an analysis of 2 threads, and then the 3rd thread related to education is what I'm working on for my dissertation currently. And so my master's project provided some background to this work in terms of how I reviewed regulatory documents for RNs and LPNs in Canada and saw how much variation there was in how RN and LPN roles are conceptualized, and how there's little collaboration between RN and PN groups regarding expectations for education and practice. And so it really raised questions for me as to how RNs and LPNs were drawing on nursing disciplinary knowledge. And so therefore, we were also seeing shifts in care model redesign in our province, and working relationships between RNs and LPNs changing. And so we really felt it was important to explore how nurses engage in negotiating their roles in practice. So the lens from which we approached these interviews and the analysis was, like I mentioned earlier, institutional ethnography. And this is Dorothy Smith's work. She's a Canadian sociologist, and she investigates how experience is socially organized and how the everyday practice of nursing is influenced by textually mediated work processes, for example, policies, procedures, guidelines, as they are enacted in everyday, every night work, and as well how people draw on conceptual resources or discourses in order to do this work. And so in IE, we see discourse as enacted, text as enacted or activated. And IE is really helpful for challenging authoritative ways of knowing. It is inherently political. You take on the standpoint of the informants to see how it all works, how it works in their everyday, every night practice, and how knowledge and power come together in the everyday work to organize people's work. And so the social arises in people's activities, and forms of social organization, are often taken for granted. And so it is to explore and uncover and reveal the taken for granted social organization of people's work. And this is a picture of another text of Dorothy, as well as a picture of Dorothy Smith. And institutional ethnography is rooted in feminist philosophical foundations, and as well rooted in Marxism and Marx's notion of work, although it is expanded beyond what Marx considered to be types of institutional work. And Dorothy talks about bifurcated consciousness, and that is two worlds that people find themselves working in. For example, she reveals in her writing about how she experienced this bifurcated consciousness when she was working as an academic, and she was the only female in the Department of Sociology in the 60s, and she was also a single parent raising children. And what she found was she was at home raising children in a certain world, if you will, and then going in as an academic in a environment where she was the only female working as a professor, and finding that the theories that they were working with in the context of sociology were not representative of her experiences as a single parent and a woman as single parent. And so she called this bifurcated consciousness. And also her work is influenced by Merleau-Ponty as seeing the body as the site of knowing. So how we are in the world, and our body is the site of how we are knowing, practicing, and being. And this creates this significance of embodied type of knowing. So there are various conceptualizations that Dorothy discusses in her various textbooks and writings, and one of them is standpoint. And like I mentioned earlier, this is taking on a standpoint of a particular group of people. So in our context, it was registered nurses and licensed practical nurses. So you're taking a political standpoint from the get-go, and oftentimes it is people that are marginalized, underrepresented. So you're looking at local informants in their everyday, every night work. Another concept of Dorothy Smith's is her notion of work, and it's a very generous conceptualization. Like I mentioned, it's more broader than, for example, Marx, although she does draw on some ideas related to Marxism. And Dorothy Smith's notion of work is anything that involves time and effort is considered work, and it's an embodied notion of work. Doing and feeling are not separate, and there's a range of doings, and these range of doings connect us with others in a complex organization of social relations. A third concept of Dorothy's is that of a problematic, and this is a chafing, puzzling event, or difficulties or contradictions that you experience. And certainly this is what I relate to in my own work when I was teaching in a practical nurse program. I had chafing, I had contradictory experiences about, am I teaching nursing, am I not, how do I know? And these problematics create disjunctures or differing views of reality. And so we see this authorized understanding versus what is really happening on the ground. Janet Rankin in her work talks about moments of feeling yucky, where these disjunctures are created by a problematic, a chafing, puzzling event. And so that is your entry into an IE type of analysis, is this notion of a problematic. Dorothy Smith also talks about boss texts. These are translocal, authoritative, replicable texts. And what these texts do is they abstract an experience into standardized institutional language. and it creates a textual representation which becomes institutionally actionable. So, for example, regulatory documents, for example, from the College of Nurses or the College of LPNs, Canadian Nurse Association, these grand organizations that create and explain and textually represent experiences on paper, in texts and resources, and in discursive conversations that may or may not be very, very different from what is actually happening on the ground. And finally, another concept of Dorothy Smith's is that of ruling relations. And these are ideological processes or texts that shape one's account of his or her experiences. And these ruling relations coordinate people activities, and they knit together forms of social organization across local settings. And so they become ideological processes as they are enacted. And so institutional ethnography tries to pick apart these ruling relations and the translocal coordination of people's activities and work. And really the fundamental question in IE is, how is it that things are organized to happen as they do? And so what we did as the foundation of our study was we engaged in meetings with stakeholders, health administrators, to identify some sites for interviews of RNs and LPNs. And we met with site managers at 2 sites to introduce the study. We toured the facilities and units, and we just talked with people on the ground, talking with people, RNs and LPNs and other staff. And we ultimately interviewed 10 RNs and 10 LPNs at 2 rural hospitals on Vancouver Island, which was actually double our intended number. And these were on medical surgical inpatient units. And the surgical units are staffed with RNs and LPNs, and the medical units are staffed with RNs, LPNs, and healthcare aides. And our informants included frontline nurses, clinical coordinators, and bed allocators. And I must say we were grateful because the nurses were extraordinarily keen to participate. So as I mentioned earlier, we did uncover, and I was working as a research assistant at this point, we revealed different lines of analysis that we focused on for our research. And the first one was the workful nature of intra and interprofessional collaboration. And that was a lot to do with how the nurses talked about working to their full scope, how they negotiated patient assignment related to tasks that they were doing, and how they managed acuity, intensity, safety, workload, and staffing. And I'm not going to go much into this here. We have presented this line of analysis at another conference, and so I'm not going to mention much more about it here. And secondly, another line of analysis was how nurses are being hooked into administrative priorities related to flow. Certainly there's a lot of concepts and discursive constructs regarding flow, and this pulls you into the literature on lean and transforming care at the bedside, WHO documents talking about task shifting, home is best discourses, introducing healthcare aides as the eyes and ears of institutions, shifting in care models, care delivery model redesign constructs, and then staff mix, skill mix, discourses, and resources. And so that was a second line of analysis that we have also completed, and this was presented by Dr. Karen McKinnon and Anne Bruce in Spain last June of 2015. And of course, my dissertation work is focusing on the third thread, which I am just currently doing the analysis, and this is looking at educational implications, skilled worker discourses, task role functions, educational silos, and as well as the lack of understanding of each other's scopes of practice. I just thought I would share with you here a bit of the analytic work that we did in terms of trying to map out how things might be organized. And this is an example of a map regarding the bed allocator function or role. And this was a position that was created for a nurse out of the emergency department, and it was to assist with timely placement of patients who needed a bed in the hospital. And so when you map it out, you start to really see just how much is going on and how much comes into play in terms of organizing what is happening on a day-in, day-out basis. For example, on the left-hand side in blue, you see the need for admission. And so this could come from various places, from the emergency department, from a doctor's office, from a transfer, same-day surgical admit, but the bed allocator is notified that someone needs a bed. And then there are conceptual resources and texts that also come into play. For example, the metric of needing to place inpatients into a bed within 10 hours of triage and emerge. We also have the goals of 80%, 85% occupancy and decreased length of stay and improving of flow. And so we have these other discourses and texts that come into play as the bed allocator begins to attempt to find a bed. And so she attends a bed meeting where they discuss bed needs and pending discharges. She does rounds on all of the units, and then she must also create a bed map to share with staff for nights and weekends when the bed allocator is not there. And this is circulated to the units. And as well, we see out of this bed meeting, there's a staffing clerk who then books staffing, receives the sick calls, and utilizes a computer system to facilitate this booking. And then we see the chat bubble where the bed allocator is pulling and drawing on resources and concepts such as over census. We must use absolutely every space. We might have to cancel surgeries, transfer, and how she talks about a constant jockeying and needing to be on top of what's going on. And certainly activating texts such as scope of practice, staffing, workload, 10 a.m. discharge, decanting a department, acuity, cohorting, holding patients, etc., etc. And so all of this is going on and impacts and organizes, if you will, how the bed allocator actually finds a bed for a patient. And then, of course, on the far right side, we see the notification of a unit. The patient arrives on the unit with a fact sheet from the ER, and then, of course, this then carries on with inpatient work of RNs and LPNs and healthcare aides as they admit the patient. And as another example, here's another analytic map of discharge and care planning work. And again, we see the unit notified of admission in the upper left-hand corner. We have an admission process, and then affecting and impacting the organization of the care on a unit are care teams, care models, and we see other conceptual resources, for example, drawn on, such as huddles, which nurses refer to as the ongoing team collaboration and communication that occurs throughout their shift between RNs, LPNs, and healthcare aides. And of course, they have institutionally sanctioned reporting mechanisms. They have written sheets that they are to do in various different colors. Some still prefer to do verbal reports. We see them talk about discharge planning being from admission forward. We see discourses of RNs needing to do care plans and all sorts of forms being activated. And these are all, when you map them out, you can see what actually comes into play and how nurses are organized in their work to do and the types of discourses that they draw on, and resources such as home is best, length of stay, in order to plan for basically a patient's discharge right from the time they are admitted, and how their work is actually organized to facilitate these processes at an institutional level. And so we see nurses work hooked into various processes of flow. Again, home is best discourses, introducing healthcare aids, efficiency discourses, lean, discharge work, length of stay discourses, as well as the who have documentation on task shifting to facilitate the development of various workers and various roles across the world. We have shifts in care models, care delivery model redesign, and staff mix as well as skill mix discourses that also come into play as nurses are enacting these processes in their day-in, day-night work. And that's really what we're trying to discover and reveal when we use institutional ethnography as a lens. So Smith, in her writings, talks about looking up into the smorgasbord of complex relations. And she has a similar diagram in her book. And so I thought I would try to explicate these complex relations for my own learning as well. And so we see the nurse or nurses at the bottom, and then we see the complex relations as they go upwards into these institutional boss techs, if you will. Smith doesn't really use the terms micro, meso, and macro. So I would now substitute the macro with the boss techs. And those are those overriding extra local texts that influence other translocal processes and texts that are hooked into by nurses' work in the everyday. So of course you can this is certainly not comprehensive and complete. You can take this up as far as you want to go in your analysis, but of course there's issues and intersections with gender, class, hierarchy, professional discourses, the bureaucratic and political organization of practice, right from the Health Professions Act, unregulated health workers, nursing association texts, skilled worker discourse, union texts, and of course discourses of work relationships, the inter- and interprofessional, etc., multidisciplinary, as well as acuity, intensity, complexity, and stability, which enters quite predominantly into how RNs and LPNs divide their work. And of course, right up you can go global with global political contexts, neoliberalism and its influences on education and practice, who we've talked about earlier, worldwide shortages of healthcare workers, and joint health professions statement on task shifting. So all of nurses' work you can explicate in an IE analysis of how their work is hooked into all of these complex relations. And the important work of IE is to really reveal these so that people can start discovering really how their work is organized often well beyond their local context. So in summary, I thought I would attempt to draw up where I am currently at, and I see my interest in RN, LPN, and healthcare aid relationships, both in education and practice, as informing and being informed by a certain destabilizing experience from my own grad school experiences and teaching and learning experience. And so this for me is my own experience of doing my dissertation work, other scholarly work that I've already done and continue to reflect upon, which is what I'm doing now by posting this older presentation, and hopefully using a critical pedagogical perspective as well to perhaps disturb the everyday, disturb the taken for granted, and really hope to look at RN, LPN relationships and education and how they are being influenced by texts, and how we as nurses might be able to move forward in different way to facilitate working relationships and making sure that patients are cared for safely and well, as nurses always try to maintain. So I really thank you so much for listening today to this presentation, and I welcome your feedback and comments. Diane B at uvic.ca. I'm also on LinkedIn, Twitter at Diane Butcher, Facebook as well. So if you have any comments, please feel free to send them along. Thanks for listening.